The end of the Second World War made the United States and the Soviet Union emerge as the only superpowers, highlighting the military and economic gap between them and the remaining belligerent nations. This situation inevitably led the two countries to clash, with the aim of definitively establishing which of them would become the sole hegemonic superpower, capable of establishing the global balance of the near future. A conflict that did not involve the use of armies, but the constant search for supremacy in every field in which it was possible to achieve it. Since 1955, space began to be considered the new frontier, an unknown and unexplored world, a new battleground, in which the watchword would be one, to win. The importance of this new challenge was evident, so much so that it was considered a real war within a war, and renamed the space race.
The importance of this feat cannot be underestimated. It brings mankind closer and closer to an actual escape into space. It also should bring closer to us the realization that we must organize our potentialities as rapidly as possible to play our proper role in entering the new dimension that is opening up before us.
This is why it was a real shock for the United States when on October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union managed to achieve an unexpected result, successfully launching the first artificial satellite in history into orbit, the Sputnik. That day, the first chapter of another story was also written, that of two brothers from Turin, the Judica Cordiglia, who as soon as they heard the news of the satellite launch, decided to try to listen to its voice. Sitting in front of their homemade receiver, they understood that this was the beginning of a new era, and that they absolutely had to be part of it. Moved by a passion for the radio which will bind them for life, and by the fascination of space exploration, the Judica Cordiglia brothers recorded some of the most important and significant moments of those years. From the telemetry of the first Sputnik, to the voice of the first man in space, their archive is a precious testimony to an era that was revolutionary for humanity. It is among some of these tapes that enigmas and mysteries linked precisely to space conquest are preserved. Recordings that are still the subject of debates today, which have raised unanswered questions, and which undoubtedly represent the dark and less visible side of that technological revolution. It is from these documents that the legend of the lost cosmonauts came to life, according to which the Soviet Union, well before Yuri Gagarin's historic feat, would have conducted multiple space launches with human crews, kept secret from public opinion, so as not to have to admit failure and keep the United States in the dark. Among the various signals they received over the years, the one involving Sputnik 7 can be considered among the most important and closely linked to their history, and one of the most indecipherable mysteries among those they faced. Growing up in an Italy that was seriously damaged by the Second World War, it was not easy for the Cordiglia brothers to concretely realize their greatest passion. The radio in those years was something not available to everyone, a real luxury reserved for a few. It was only thanks to their ingenuity and strong determination that they were able to take their first steps in the world of radio listening. Helped by their father and grandparents, they built their first equipment with recycled material. The radio will be the center of a bond that will last their entire lives. Years of radio listening have resulted in an enormous archive of recordings. In it are preserved not only important historical moments, but also some disturbing mysteries that have never been clarified. The first of these enigmas, considered to be the genesis of the legend of the lost cosmonauts, is dated November 28, 1960. At 1:43 p.m., Italian time, the two radio amateurs picked up a signal among the hiss and disturbances of the radio frequencies. A signal in Morse code, and with enigmatic text. SOS to the whole world. The message was in English, and repeated over and over again. The emission was characterized by some anomalies. The first was duration. Normally, in fact, satellite signals can be picked up for short periods of time, appearing and disappearing at intervals, a consequence of the orbit around the Earth. The transmission received that day by the Cordiglia brothers, however, had a decidedly longer duration, which allowed it to be listened to without any interruption from 1:43 p.m. until 2:05 p.m., when the signal progressively weakened until it disappeared. Another anomaly was found in the Doppler effect, an apparent change in frequency of sound when its source is moving. That day, it presented itself in an atypical way, and gave them the idea that the origin of the signal came from a fixed point in the sky, in total contrast to the orbit of a normal satellite.
Molto lento, cioè come se il veicolo non fosse in orbita intorno alla Terra, ma fosse in un punto della volta celeste e stesse allontanandosi dalla Terra, ma in modo estremamente lento.
They came to the conclusion that it might be a call for help from space. The SOS from a cosmonaut on board a drifting capsule, perhaps due to an incorrect re-entry maneuver, or a fault. There was no way of knowing, and the only thing they could do was to listen until the signal became so faint that it disappeared into the hiss of radio frequencies, forever. On that date, there would be no official Soviet missions, and the only compatible vehicle would be Sputnik 6, launched on December 1, 1960. Developed under the code name Venera 1VA No. 1, the Sputnik 7 probe was launched on February 4, 1961 from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, at 1 hour 18 minutes and 3 seconds Coordinated Universal Time. Mounted on a Molniya carrier rocket, it reached low Earth orbit apparently without any problem, at least until the ignition of the fourth stage, when a sudden malfunction occurred, which would prove fatal to the success of the mission. Sputnik 7, together with its sister probe, was designed based on the previous vehicle, the M1, which was supposed to explore Mars. The heavy Sputnik mission, on the other hand, involved the probe's entry into the atmosphere of Venus, so as to study its conformation, dangers and characteristics. That fourth-stage failure prevented it from leaving low Earth orbit, where it remained forced for 22 days, until February 26, 1961, when it decayed in an area of Siberia, destroying itself. Western observers immediately suspected that it was a failed manned mission, and this was what made its launch particularly interesting. The suspicion is based on some critical issues and oddities of the vehicle itself. The 6,483 kilograms of weight, and the over 2 meters of height, were 2 parameters out of scale when compared to the dimensions of the automated probes of that time. Even the analysis of the onboard instrumentation does not seem to justify the weight and dimensions. The payload was composed of a magnetometer for detecting the magnetic field of Venus, a detector of charged particles and cosmic rays for studying the interplanetary environment, a radiometer for temperature, and a sensor for analyzing micrometeorites. Once stuck in low orbit, however, it seems that the probe still managed to transmit data, although there was never a confirmation or a denial from the Soviet Union. Of these signals, there are 3 recordings made on different dates. 2 are from the 4th of February 1961, produced respectively by what was at the time the NATO Tracking Center in Ankara, Turkey, and the Bochum Observatory, in Germany. A third, dated February 6, was made by a radio amateur from Oslo. The Ankara Tracking Center recorded the emission at 10:37 a.m. local time, and publicly disclosed the transmission frequency, 19.994 MHz. The same was not done by the Bochum Radio Astronomy Observatory, which picked up the signal always on the same day, at 9:03 in the morning, without communicating the frequency. This document at first was suspected of not being a transmission of space origin, but rather ground-to-ground. The Oslo tape is dated February 6 at 2:55 p.m. The radio frequency is 20.009 MHz, very similar to that declared by the Tracking Center in Ankara. All 3 recordings are very similar to each other, and share more than one characteristic typical of satellite signals. The similarities between the 3 recordings are clear. There is little doubt that it is the same 2-tone sound, with minimal differences in speed and intensity, always accompanied by a marked Doppler effect. The question, which has been debated over time and which still remains unanswered, focuses on the very nature of the signal. For some it is of the telemetric type, while for others it is that of a transponder. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union never confirmed any transmissions from Sputnik 7. An important detail concerns the background noise, very clear in the recording made by the Bochum Observatory, and which will later prove to be an important element, useful in trying to clarify the matter. The news that 2 radio amateurs from Turin had received an SOS from space and that the frequencies on which they had intercepted it had been confirmed as correct by the Bochum Observatory, had attracted attention of Italian-Swiss radio, in search of sources as free from the propaganda of the two superpowers, who wanted the Cordiglia brothers as their space experts. At that point, it was clear that the equipment they had was no longer sufficient. Thus they found a former German bunker from the Second World War, not far from Turin. From that moment on, that would be the headquarters of their future activities related to radio listening, and it was called Bert Tower.
Al centro radioascolto spaziale Torre Bert di Torino, organizzato dai fratelli Judica, i radiotelescopi intercettano i segnali radio emessi dalla capsula. Unico in Italia, il centro ha lo scopo di registrare gli impulsi radio provenienti dai corpi spinti in orbita e attraverso successive comparazioni di fornire al NASA, il centro americano preposto alle ricerche spaziali, tutti i possibili dati tecnici.
They procured better reception equipment, and personally built new larger and more performing antennas, so as to ensure they could keep up with the escalation that the space race was experiencing. In fact, it was now clear to everyone that something big would happen shortly thereafter. It was precisely as specialized experts of the RTS that the Judica Cordiglia brothers found themselves face to face with a new enigma. On the evening of February 2, 1961, at 8:25 p.m. Italian time, the two brothers picked up a strange signal, once again scanning the frequencies usually used by the Soviet Union for space activities. The documents produced that day were also their first broadcast on Italian-Swiss radio. They couldn't know it, but they were listening to a signal sent by a probe that will be officially launched just 2 days later.
Attualità. Da Torre Bert, i nostri collaboratori specializzati, i fratelli Judica Cordiglia.
Qui Torre Bert vi parlano Achille e Giambattista Judica Cordiglia.
The content of the tape, dated February 2, 1961, is identical to that of the documents made 2 days later by the NATO Center and the Bochum Observatory, and 4 days later in Oslo. And the differences in this first recording and those of the 4th and February 6 are minimal. Even without careful listening, it is difficult to deny the incredible similarity between the two-tone sound in the Cordiglia brothers' recording and the same sound present in the Ankara, Bochum and Oslo recordings. The absence of documents, unfortunately, prevents us from stating with certainty that the signal is the same in all four recordings, but theoretically it certainly seems that it is. If this first recording is then compared more carefully to the one produced in Bochum, the similarity is practically total. The two radio amateurs, however, continued to listen to the emission until it disappeared among the hiss of the radio frequencies. It will only be at 10:14 p.m. that it will be received and recorded again. Initially, it seems to be the same signal heard a few hours earlier. It will only be a few seconds after the start of recording that a new sound overlaps the two-tone one. A labored, suffocated breath, the gasp of a man in serious oxygen deficiency, which leads them to hypothesize that he is a cosmonaut. The suffering of a man trapped in a spacecraft, and that if the Judica brothers' hypothesis is correct, it will be officially launched only 2 days later, without a crew. What made that radio transmission even more cryptic and mysterious was a strange beat that surfaced a few seconds later.
Un rantolo, un respiro soffocato, un sospiro, direi da paziente enfisematoso. Poi di nuovo il segnale di presenza ed è affiorato, perché è proprio affiorato, un ritmo. Mi ha fatto pensare, a me, studente in medicina, che si trattasse del battito di un cuore, perché nell'ambito della pulsazione c'è una pulsazione accelerata, una pausa e poi riprende, vale a dire un'extrasistole.
At this point, it was not at all easy for them to find meaning in that issue. The intuition as to what the nature of that rhythm could be came from a killer who had the impression of listening to a heartbeat. A theory that could not be made lightly. At that point it was necessary to find confirmation. It was precisely for this reason that they decided to turn to the young Achilles University professor, who was a medical student at the time, Dr. Oddities. Oddities in those years was considered a luminary in the field of cardiology, and a real authority, also known internationally for being the first surgeon to carry out an open-heart operation via extracorporeal circulation. Contacted by telephone that same evening, he agreed to help them, offering them medical advice. On that occasion, Oddities was only able to hear the rattle live, but listening to it in his presence was an element in support of the genuineness of those documents. Subsequently, aided by his medical team, he analyzed both signals indicated by the Cordigglias as biological, and decided to speak about them publicly.
Ascoltando ripetutamente questo nastro, ho potuto nettamente udire due ritmi. L'uno che ripete, sia pure nelle grandi linee fondamentali, il ritmo cardiaco, ed una seconda serie di suoni che ricordano molto da vicino, in modo suggestivo, un respiro forzato e affannoso.
Naturally, the lack of certain information and further data in this regard forced the surgeon to say as little as possible. However, he not only recognized the extreme resemblance of that gasp to the breathing that a man in severe lack of oxygen would have done, but also some characteristics in common between that strange rhythm and the heartbeat. Sometime later, it was discovered that the two brothers from Turin were not the only ones to have heard that strange rattle. In fact, an Italian radio amateur named Mario del Rosario managed to record an excerpt of it on February 4, 1961. Unfortunately, the existence of this tape is known to few, and only in very rare cases can traces of it be found in the various videos on the subject available online. Del Rosario's document is important for several reasons, and if on the one hand it is a further element confirming the existence of the signal and its transmission in those days, and therefore a further element supporting the very validity of the Cordiglia material, on the other hand it seriously questions the conclusions. Before we see why, let's listen to the recording from that day. There is little doubt that the signal picked up on the 4th of February 1961 by Mario del Rosario is the same one recorded 2 days earlier by the Cordiglias. It is precisely this that seriously casts doubt on the thesis of the cosmonaut in agony. It is unthinkable that a man who on February 2nd was in a condition of serious oxygen deficiency and therefore close to death, could have survived for 2 whole days, until February 4th. All of this raises further important questions. If that wasn't the breathing of a cosmonaut, what was? The undeniable similarity between the signals heard on February 2nd and those on the 4th immediately suggests that the origin was Sputnik 7, and consequently that it was actually launched 2 days before the official date. And again, Del Rosario's interception would suggest that a cosmonaut survived for 2 whole days in conditions of serious breathing difficulties, but is it likely that it could have happened? A precious and authoritative source of information is represented by the diaries of Kamenin, military manager of the Soviet space program at the time, whose notes allow us to get a clearer idea of the days before and after the launch of Sputnik 7. To better understand how the probe and its twin were made, we need to take a more careful look at the technical details, starting with the way they were designed and built. Both were based on two previous vehicles that had the goal of exploring Mars. Unlike Venera 1, Sputnik 7 was built in a hurry, without any preliminary ground tests being carried out. The body of the probe was essentially a sealed cylinder, 2.035 meters high and 1.05 meters in diameter. As mentioned initially, the upper end was spherical in shape, equipped with a heat shield to protect from the heat being released into the atmosphere, which should have detached itself from the rest of the vehicle and landed on hypothetical oceans of Venus thanks to a parachute. This characteristic makes one think of the capsules that will shortly be used for cosmonauts' re-entry into the atmosphere. Sputnik 7 was also equipped with a highly directional and high-gain parabolic mesh antenna, with an overall diameter of 2.33 meters, and solar panels on both sides of the central body. The communication, control, navigation and propulsion systems were the same as the M1 probe, previously built for the exploration of Mars, but with one fundamental difference: the replacement of the radio beacon for the orientation of the antenna towards Earth during telemetry sessions, with a more sophisticated and precise sensor. Kamenan in his diaries does not hide a certain concern regarding the high number of technical problems relating to the probe, problems that seem like they can't be solved in a short time. Furthermore, Soviet technicians were simultaneously working on another project, considered by many responsible for the space program to be far more important: the development of the revolutionary Vostok capsules, which would take the first man into space. The fear was that of accumulating further delays, with the risk of being anticipated by the United States. As of January 18, 1961, a series of problems still unresolved are listed. Those relating to the radio system are of greater concern. It is decided to postpone the launch of Sputnik 7 until at least January 26. On January 31, Kamenan meets with other senior leaders of the space program at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Although there are still serious problems to resolve, it is decided that a launch will still be attempted on February 2. At 11:30 p.m. on February 1, 1961, Sputnik 7 was refueled on the launch pad of the Baikonur Cosmodrome, ready for launch after midnight. At 2 a.m., the mission was suddenly cancelled. The reasons are not clear, but it seems to have involved problems with the probe's gyroscope. The last entries will be dated February 4 and 5. Kamenan will talk about the launch of the probe and the failed outcome of the mission. But the most interesting part is the one relating to the Soviet State Commission, which will meet 1 hour after the failure of Sputnik 7. Among the members of the Commission, there is concern regarding the strategy to be adopted with public opinion. They must decide whether or not to make a public statement about the mission and its outcome. Kamenan absolutely wants any statement that is made to be as downplayed as possible. His fear is that Sputnik 7 could be mistaken for a reconnaissance satellite, or worse, a failed manned mission. This last part is very important. At that moment no one, outside of the men present at the meeting, is aware of the mission that has just taken place. What is especially striking is that it is precisely the possibility of exchanging Sputnik 7 with a manned mission that worries the members of the Commission, taking it almost for granted. Ultimately, this was the Soviet declaration made on February 5, 1961. The rocket didn't reach Venus, but it did demonstrate a new rocket through could deliver an 8-ton thermonuclear warhead anywhere on the planet. In support of the interception of the Cordiglia brothers, there is still one element, which must be evaluated as purely circumstantial, however significant it may seem. The official data of Sputnik 7 indicate its orbital period, or else the time it takes to complete an entire orbit around the Earth, as 89.8 minutes. Now, if we look at the times at which the signal was recorded on the evening of February 2, 1961, we realize that, reasonably approximate, they correspond to the period of the probe. The first interception was made at 8:25 p.m. Italian time. Subsequently, the signal will be picked up again at 10:14 p.m. and, one last time, in the presence of Dr. Dogliotti, at 11:38 p.m. Also regarding the interceptions of February 4th, carried out by the NATO Center in Ankara and the Bochum Observatory, the times seem to coincide with the Sputnik 7 period. Bochum indicates the reception time as 9:03 in the morning. An hour and a half later, the signal is heard from the tracking center, precisely at 10:37 a.m. In conclusion, there are some observations to make. The first concerns the capsule located at the upper end of Sputnik 7. According to the official technical documents, some medals commemorating the mission had been inserted inside it. Having installed a heat shield and a parachute, however, seems to make more sense from the perspective of its use as a capsule for cosmonauts' re-entry into the atmosphere, rather than as a container for simple commemorative objects. And again, if in reality, Sputnik 7 had actually been launched on February 2nd instead of the 4th. This would explain the Judica interceptions, although Del Rosario's tape makes the dying cosmonaut theory unlikely. On the other hand, the Soviet Union had already adopted the strategy of silence regarding space launches. Take for example Kamenin's notes in his diaries regarding the launch of 2 dogs which took place on December 22, 1960, aboard a Vostok capsule under development. The mission partially failed. The technicians were convinced that the 2 dogs were dead, but instead they were found among the wreckage of the vehicles still alive. Nonetheless, on December 26, the Communist Party banned any public announcements regarding the mission. It is therefore clear that the Soviet Union had not the slightest intention of admitting any failure, even partial as in the case of the 2 dogs. Is it plausible then to imagine any admission of responsibility for the failure of a manned mission as Sputnik 7 was suspected to be? We will probably never know how things really went that day. The Soviet giant remained impenetrable for the entire duration of the Cold War, guarding the events linked to space conquest with even more attention. If the Judica brothers really recorded the last moments of the life of a cosmonaut, trapped in glacial space, it will probably remain a mystery, and it will be up to each of us to evaluate the elements, and draw conclusions. But that February 1961 was not the last chapter of this story. The 2 brothers were about to encounter a new enigma, which will perhaps prove even more indecipherable. The news of a rattle from space intercepted by 2 Italian radio amateurs was received with irritation by the Soviet Union, which however always denied any type of connection between the intercepted signals and its space program. However, Soviet intelligence personnel attempted to approach the Judicas, introducing themselves as journalists. What the purpose of this move was is unclear, but it forced Italian counterintelligence to intervene.
Un pomeriggio eravamo a casa e suona il campanello, si presenta un signore, dopo l'intervista lasciò la nostra casa, suonò nuovamente il campanello e si presentò un altro signore che dice: voi siete i fratelli Judica? Sì, siamo i fratelli Judica. Dice: da voi è venuto questo signore, mette la mano in tasca, tira fuori una fotografia e ci fa vedere la fotografia di questo signore. Dice: questo signore non è soltanto un giornalista, fa anche altri lavori, quindi diffidate. Io mi presento, sono un agente del controspionaggio italiano.
Il SIFAR, era il SIFAR.
The agency asked the brothers for help, with the aim of obtaining more direct information in the field of radio listening, and in particular on Soviet spacecraft. They interpreted those attentions as confirmation of the validity of their interceptions. One thing was still missing: an interpreter. It was absolutely necessary to understand what they were able to capture. They turned to their sister, Maria Teresa, who accepted immediately.
Due calamite avevano bisogno di capire, di comprendere, e non era, in quel periodo non era neanche facile trovare delle persone, delle interpreti russe, e allora in quel momento mi sono impegnata al massimo per cercare di imparare il russo. Per carità, potevano dirmi di fare qualunque cosa, io l'avrei fatta a occhi chiusi.
3 months after hearing the mysterious rattle, the Cordiglia brothers managed to pick up strange new transmissions on Soviet frequencies dedicated to space activities. The recordings were made on 3 different days: 18, 19 and the 23rd of May 1961, and until 2017, only one of these had been made public. These tapes are excerpts from radio conversations. Listening to these recordings, one easily realizes that they are all one-way communications. People clearly answer questions, and in some cases they ask them themselves, but in all of them the answers are totally absent. The reason has never been clarified, since these were conversations that were hypothesized to take place between ground control centers and cosmonauts in orbit involved in missions not publicly declared. It is possible that the Soviet Union, trying to protect the secrecy of the operations as much as possible, considered the transmissions from the ground more important and therefore more inaccessible to any radio amateurs, rather than those sent from space. It is therefore conceivable that the signals transmitted by the control centers were on different frequencies than those sent by the capsules in flight. A final consideration must be made. Of the 3 recordings, only in the one dated May 23rd was a partial translation attached, while for the others the most relevant content was summarized. The audio was listened to by 2 interpreters, who replied that they were not able to translate it adequately enough, but confirmed the parts already translated as correct. On May 18th they intercepted an excerpt of a radio conversation in Russian, in which a woman was heard speaking, whose identity was never officially identified, but who for the 2 radio amateurs was a cosmonaut. Although the audio is quite noisy, you can hear her utter a disturbing phrase. The following day they pick up more. At 6 in the morning, Italian time, another excerpt of conversation is recorded, in which a man shouts into the radio. "Attention! The people of Turin listen to us. If you find them, isolate the data." Perhaps by the word data, man means the signal. For the Cordiglias, at a certain point, one would hear the name Kamenin, responsible for the Soviet space program at the time. The last audio referring to May 1961 was the only one made public until 2017, as well as one of the best known. The recording would refer to the last moments of the re-entry into the atmosphere of a capsule with a cosmonaut on board, later renamed Ludmilla by the Cordiglia brothers. The woman states over the radio that she feels hot and sees a flame. Recording would end with the destruction of the space capsule. Among the hypotheses on what could have happened, two are those considered most plausible and probable. One hypothesizes the destruction of the capsule following an incorrect calculation of the re-entry angle, overheating. While the other, never sufficiently proven and long debated, claims that it was detonated remotely once there was certainty of its return to foreign territory. This last theory is based on the fact that the Vostok capsules and its Zenit twins were equipped with a self-destruct system. There seems to be some similarity between the woman's voice recorded on May 18th and the one on the 23rd, although it is difficult to establish this, considering the enormous difference in sound quality between the two tapes. In those days, there were no Soviet launches, nor any documentation available to understand the true identity of the woman renamed Ludmilla. In 1963, the Cordiglia brothers took part in a very famous television quiz show of the time, answering questions about space and ultimately winning. Thus they managed to fulfill one of their greatest dreams, visiting NASA. That trip was a precious opportunity to further strengthen the bond between the Torre Bert Space Radio Listening Center and the American Space Agency, and it was also an opportunity for a mutual exchange of information. The guys from Turin had greatly impressed the NASA managers who welcomed them upon their arrival, listening to the reel on which the voice of John Glenn, the first American to enter orbit around the Earth, was recorded. What impressed the technicians was that the transmission frequencies of radio communications had never been made public. On April 7, 1965, Cameron, irritated by the outcry generated by the Cordiglia wiretaps, addressed the topic in an interview. He used harsh words towards them, and once again denied any connection between those signals and the space missions of the Soviet Union, and branded everything as inventions. For many, and especially for the Judica, that reaction was an involuntary confirmation of the validity of their work.
Quella smentita ha in un certo senso convalidato tutto il lavoro che abbiamo fatto, cioè siamo riusciti con poche apparecchiature, con pochi mezzi, a sfondare uno Stato come l'Unione Sovietica, dalla potenza dell'Unione. Siamo riusciti a andare a scavare probabilmente cose che a loro davano fastidio, hanno dato fastidio.
The adventure of the Cordiglia brothers, which began with listening to the first Sputnik, was about to end, together with the space race. The challenge launched by American President John Kennedy on May 25, 1961, in a memorable speech to Congress, was now close to being won. The United States would reach the moon by the end of the decade, plant the stars and stripes on its surface, and bring its space heroes home safely. 12 years had passed since that day in October '57, 12 years of great undertakings, sacrifices and determination. And the radio had been at the heart of it all. The two children who listened to the voices of distant people in their bedroom were now grown up and were preparing to witness, once again, a historic milestone. On the night of July 20, 1969, Bert Tower, live on Swiss radio, was listening.
A 400 piedi di altezza, sono 1200 metri. 100 metri soltanto dalla superficie, 100 metri possiamo quasi. Sono discesi in questo momento, è stato attuato l'impatto sulla superficie della Luna. È una cosa formidabile. Per la prima volta nella storia l'uomo è disceso sul satellite naturale. Un sogno di secoli è stato coronato veramente in una maniera perfetta, veramente in un modo formidabile. È una cosa che ci riempie di brividi. Armstrong ha gridato: siamo giù.
È finito il mistero.
Il mistero.
Il mistero era finito, era tutto ormai all'onore delle cronache, e la ricerca, la vera ricerca sul ricevitore era praticamente finita. Non era televisione, era radio. Era la radio che ci parlava, e come sempre la radio non ti fa vedere chi c'è al microfono. Tu immagini, e lì l'immaginazione era aperta addirittura sull'universo, sullo spazio.